All right. So the meeting is being recorded just to allow those who are not able to make it live tonight for the training session to be able to review the video at a later date. So I hope you're all okay with that. And essentially, what we want to do is to dive right into our training session. We have our trainer for tonight on the line, and we are really excited to have her with us, Dr. Samantha. You're very welcome, and thank you for your time and dedication into preparing for the session with us tonight. We know it's going to be a really insightful evening, and we're going to definitely learn something that we didn't know before. And so, for those of you who are not familiar with her, Dr. Samantha-Kaye is currently a researcher within the Department of Education at the University of Oxford. And we all know the University of Oxford is one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the whole world. So it's a very, very good position for her to be in. She's actually formally educated in Jamaica, where she completed her Bachelor of Science in Psychology. And then in England, she received her Master of Arts in Education and completed her PhD in Psychology in Australia. And she uses a cognitive psychology lens. Her expertise and what she aims to do is to link these areas with evidence-based e-learning technologies to improve teaching, learning, and assessment outcomes. So that means there's use of technology to be able to really support the educational processes that she's implementing. And she's been actively involved in education development over the past 10 years. And she also started up the Marlon Christie Scholarship. And that's a scholarship that provides funding for Jamaican students with reading difficulties to attend university. So that's really incredible work. And then also some social impact from her. And currently, her work is overall informed by her experience as an education advocate and researcher in Jamaica, in England, and in Australia, and mostly within the K-12 sector, and as well within the NGO, private and community organizations, and also with the UN. She has a university associate, she has experience as a university associate at Curtin University and a teaching associate at Monash University in Australia, as part of their undergraduate and graduate psychology teaching teams. Currently, Dr. Johnston is an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, another prestigious university on her record here. And over there, she seeks to strengthen internet governance within online learning. And in particular, she's interested in ensuring that the rights of young students are protected while they interact within the digital space, including elevating the voices of students in decision-making processes. Above all, Dr. Samantha believes that every child should have the same opportunity to shape their destiny, emphasizing that we cannot always build the future for them, but we can build them for the future. Consequently, her goal is to ensure that teachers implement evidence-based teaching approaches that will strengthen transferring and critical reading in all students. Wow, what a wonderful, wonderful opportunity we have to have Dr. Johnston here with us. So once again, welcome. We're really excited to have you. And I'm going to hand over to you so that you start with the session that you prepared for tonight. We're really excited for the content tonight. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Perlin, and to Rosalind as well for making me always feel so welcomed. And it is really an honor of mine to be able to share with you what I've learned throughout my research over the last couple of years. And so I think, also wanted to thank Rosalind for the presentation just a while ago with Dr. Gad, because it leads beautifully into my presentation today. And he essentially ended on saying, how can we help? And today I wanted to extend a bit about what I know in an effort, or rather with the aim of ensuring that we help students with learning difficulties. So as part of that presentation, or rather as part of the presentation, we know that as Dr. Gad said, for persons who were here before, that there are many types of learning difficulties, but by far, dyslexia is really one of the main ones and really my area of expertise. So today I will really be speaking about learning difficulties broadly defined, but the examples that I'll be using will be generated mainly from reading, from the area of reading. And so today I'm going to be speaking a bit about how persons cope with learning difficulties and also some of the behavioral issues and concerns that we might have when it comes on to dyslexia if it's left unaddressed, for example. But really the bulk of my presentation will be on this topic of the science of reading. And I've been an advocate of the science of reading because it's really underpinned by what we call an evidence-based approach. So if you do have any questions throughout the talk, just feel free to put it in the chat. And I can't necessarily see the chat, but I'm going to ask Perlin or Roslyn to man the chat as I go along. And if there's any question that comes up, I would definitely like to take the opportunity to respond. So I'm going to start off today by speaking a bit about my brother Marlon. So this is Marlon, meet Marlon. So when Marlon was growing up, so he essentially, he's in his 30s now. And when he was growing up, we would receive reports at the end of year reports after you've done your examination. And these are just some of the things that he would have heard throughout the years on his report. So he has been called stupid, he has been called lazy, he has been called slow, hard-headed, and dislikes reading. And imagine this is coming from a teacher. So of course, unfortunately, when you're in the school system, you would expect that teachers, for example, would have a little bit more understanding of maybe learning difficulties and more specifically dyslexia, for example. And so I'm going to pose a question to you. So imagine this is what you receive for 6 years of your primary school years when you get your report. You see stupid, lazy, slow, hard-headed, and you dislike reading. And I'm going to ask, and I put this beautiful diagram on the screen because there's a particular theory called Brunfriend Berner's ecological theory. And what it essentially says is that, as you can see, we as individuals, we're at the center and we're surrounded by these different systems each and every day. You have home, you have school, you have the larger community, you have the larger society that you're existing in. And Marlon's experience within the society is one that calls him stupid at every level. So even laws in Jamaica don't really cater so much so to persons who have special needs. So I'm going to pose a question to you. How would you feel? So I open the chat if you want to post in the chat. How would you feel if you were called these names for maybe the majority of your life? Maybe some of you have that experience as well. So I see some persons posting the chat, but I can't quite open the chat at the moment.
So someone is saying I would just leave school. Really demotivating. These are the comments. Please put in the chats. How would you feel if you are called stupid, dumb? Someone is saying they will be very sad, demoralized. Yeah. So I will lose my confidence. Yeah.
And that's a big thing in terms of confidence. In fact, in Jamaica, we have a saying that says, without confidence, you're twice defeated in the race of life. And so as part of that experience with Marlon and a lot of what you're reporting in the chat in terms of loss of confidence, sad, wanting to leave school, this is what we find. Not surprisingly, it's aligned with what the research is actually saying around how students feel. They use this term called learned helplessness. And it's basically you've lost hope. You don't want to do anything at all in life. And so unfortunately, instead of, for example, being slow, my brother Marlon, he has dyslexia, which we know it's a learning difficulty, which really affects your ability to read accurately, fluently, and sometimes even understand what you're reading. And this is, predominantly caused by what we call poor phonological processing. So dyslexia is a speech-based issue. So you're not understanding the sounds that make up a word. Sorry, I want to pause here. I think Deborah had a hand up. If you wanted to unmute yourself, Deborah, and ask your question if you still wanted to ask.
I don't see a hand up. I think she probably mistakenly did that.
Okay.
Please, if you have any question, put them in the chat room and then we'll read it out. After her presentation, we can open the mics and then you can ask direct questions as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So what we know is between 7 and 17% of persons within the population, and this is globally, experience dyslexia in some way, shape, or form. And as a result, if you find it difficult to read, of course, it's not that you dislike reading. You're going to have little engagement with reading because you've essentially lost your confidence, as someone mentioned earlier. Now, the thing is, Marlon then went on to graduate at the top of his class, even though he had dyslexia. And so, what is the cause of this? And this is what I want to share with you a bit today. And this is why I'm such an advocate of the science of reading, because with a supportive family and also understanding the correct measures to take, and this is not necessarily has anything to do, a lot of times I get questions from teachers and parents, for example, saying that, okay, it may be too expensive. There are things that in reality, these interventions, they can be expensive. However, this was not the case with Marlon, because we understood some of the things that we could do at home, for example, and these are some of the things that I want to share with you today around the science of reading. But before I get to that, I just wanted to reiterate that the dyslexia, when it comes on to behavioral issues or behavioral concerns, you'll find what the research tells us, that there's a lot of anxiety and depression, avoidance. I think somebody mentioned this earlier when I asked the question around, well, how would you feel? Avoidance, not wanting to go to school, but also when you're in school, you tend to find persons with dyslexia being at the back of the class. They don't want to read. They engage in rule-breaking behavior, similar to what Dr. Gad was saying previously, where you find a high proportion of persons with learning difficulties and dyslexia in particular, they're in the juvenile delinquency system, they're in prisons. And oftentimes there's a term in Jamaica, I don't know if there's the Ghanaian term, we say people are acting out, the students are acting out, or they're badly behaved, or they're just bad. These are unfortunately some of the things that teachers say in the classroom, but this is because they haven't been properly identified. And of course, a big part of some of the research that I've been doing is looking around how students who have dyslexia, one of the manifestations when it comes on to behavioral issues is around executive functioning. So executive function just means there's this part of your brain at the front of your brain, your frontal lobe, and it's responsible for logical thinking, logical thought, and being able to stay on task and concentrate and be able to attend to things. You find that persons who have dyslexia, they find it quite difficult to do these sort of things. So you'll find that a lot of persons who have dyslexia, I'm going to use the same term as Dr. Gad. There's a comorbidity, so they have dyslexia and ADHD at the same time. And often there's a high percentage that if you have dyslexia, you'll be more likely to have ADHD as well. So what are some of the coping strategies that we can use when you found out that you have dyslexia? And this is where the behavioral modification strategies emerge. And in fact, there tends to be 4 behavioral modification strategies that we find in the literature. The first is prompting, so giving gestures and instructions of how to pronounce things correctly. For example, shaping is really a progressive way of achieving a desired behavior. So with dyslexia, the desired behavior is to be able to read accurately and to understand text. And so if you expose students to correct environment. So for example, reading more books, for example, that can help students to be able to improve. Coaching is transforming research into practice, and modeling is, of course, if a student is incorrectly pronouncing something, not correctly pronouncing something, then you'd model the correct pronunciation. But for my presentation today, I want to focus on coaching. And the reason why, it's not that the other strategies aren't effective, but coaching really lends itself to implementing what we know to be evidence-based and what we know to be good research, and we turn that into practical ways of helping students who have dyslexia. And in fact, if you look at the top of the screen, there is a little note that says using selected behavior modification practices, and this study was done in Kenya. So I was trying to find a study in the Ghanaian context. I didn't find any in the Ghanaian context looking at comparing the effectiveness of these 4 practices, but I did find a study in Kenya. And what these researchers found is that when you compare these 4 strategies, the most influential and the most effective one is actually coaching. And coaching, in my interpretation and what I know from previous research, proper coaching is always based on the science of reading. And most of my presentation will be based on that today, because when we think about behavior modification, we think about therapy, for example, and that is fine. But for reading problems, a big part of modifying behavior is actually addressing the behavior. How do we improve a student's reading outcome? And one way of doing that is implementing the science of reading. But unfortunately, we know that there's research out there. So why is it that the research is not making its way into the classrooms? Or why is it that when parents are at home, why is it not making its way into the home context? And for me, this is a concern that I've been grappling with, especially coming from Jamaica. And Jamaica is a developing context. We don't have a lot of research in our context. And unfortunately, we don't have a dissemination of the research. So some of the reasons why knowledge of how to properly coach students in this area is that unfortunately, teacher training programs, education, and especially the teaching of reading is not treated, unfortunately, it's not treated like other programs. So you will find persons who in the field of medicine, my best friend is a medical doctor, and you'll find that persons in the field of medicine sort of revere the profession. Unfortunately, teacher training programs are not sufficiently equipped, and we find that this is even more problematic in developing contexts. We also find that there's a misconception that reading is natural. So sometimes I'll talk to teachers, sometimes I'll talk to parents, and they'll mention to me that, oh, the child will just read on their own. This is not the case. We were never designed or programmed to read. And in fact, when we look at the diagram here that's developed by Nancy Young, what Nancy Young says that when you look at the top of the chart here, only around 35 to 40% of students learning to read is relatively easy. But when you get to the bottom, you have most persons really need that explicit, systematic, sequential instruction. And that's essentially what the science of reading is. And of course, around 10 to 17% of students will need this explicit, systematic instruction even more because they have dyslexia. So by and large, reading is not a natural process. We need to be taught directly how to read. Unfortunately, there is poor training in psychology. So my background is primarily psychology. And even though I'm in education, my background is psychology. And even though we do the research in psychology, we understand brain structures. Unfortunately, we know how to do good research, but not every psychologist or not every researcher in psychology knows how to effectively communicate what they found to persons who really need that information. So we need to actually find more ways of disseminating that. And then finally, the research is so huge. So if you look on journal articles from that have been published from around 2019, there are over 250 articles that focus on how we can improve reading. And I'll just give you an insight into how large the space is. So imagine these are just some journals. These are the top journals that usually teachers go to find empirical studies. So when we say empirical, we mean studies that have done like intervention, for example, and collect data to show that an intervention have actually really worked. So these are really the top tier journals or spaces where people go to find effective reading strategies. Now, you have other literacy journals that routinely publish reading research. And yet again, you have these journals there growing that commonly include other empirical articles. And even yet more, again, these journals that you see on screen. So every page that I've just shown you, every slide that I've just shown you, these journals are completely different. So can you imagine a teacher or a parent? You're so busy, a teacher is so busy in the classroom, dealing with, I know in developed contexts, you have maybe 15 to 20 students in your class, but in developing countries like Jamaica, teachers can have up to 70 students in one class. So a teacher doesn't necessarily have the time to sit down and go through all these journals to find what works and what doesn't work. And so this is where I come in. And a part of what I've been doing over the last couple of years, especially during COVID, is to really sensitize, to go through the journals myself and then explain what are the most effective ways. So just a bit about my background. I did my bachelor's in psychology, specifically on reading development. And then I went on to do my master's in education, and this was focused really on the science of reading, and then my PhD in psychology. And I worked a bit, I left academia a bit, and I worked in the educational technology industry. And it was really around building online learning platforms to really improve students' engagement. And a part of that was developing reading assessment. So where I am based now, I'm in an assessment center. And as part of that, my aim today and really in life is to make the science of reading, learning, and design really accessible, or more accessible, to teachers, parents, with the aim of really advancing the life outcomes for all students. And I highlight the science of reading here because this is what I'll be focused on today in the presentation. So the science of reading is just what skills are involved in reading, how do these skills work together, how is reading related to speaking and spelling, and how do children learn to read. And so an overview of the remainder of the presentation today, I will just give you a bit on the basis of what reading development entails. And then the bulk of the presentation will be looking at coaching strategies in three areas of, or rather three outcomes of reading. So reading accuracy, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. And of course, and then I'll end the presentation with a take-home message. But before that, I'll just speak maybe 1 or 2 minutes on assessment and referrals. So these three outcomes, usually when we think about reading, we just think about reading as a broad umbrella. But these are the three outcomes that we want students to be able to achieve. We want them to read accurately, we want them to read fluently, and we want them to understand what they're reading. So I'll start off by talking about the basis of reading. So as part of reading, the core element of reading is what we call phonological awareness. And ever so often, I hear persons saying that reading is visual. It is. I mean, you are reading and your eyes are seeing the letters, but reading is actually a sound-based process. And this is what phonological means. Phonology means understanding the sound structure of language. So phonological awareness is being aware of the fact that reading is sound-based. And as such, there are different aspects of phonological awareness, and I'll get into them later on. So I won't delve into what blending and segmenting is. We know what rhyming is, mat, pat, sat. But I'm going to focus on blending and segmenting, and I'll explain what that is in a couple of moments. Phonological processing also takes into consideration what we call phonological memory. So it just means that you're able to maintain the accurate sound representations in memory. Because if I teach you the sound of letters, for example, or the sounds in words, if you can't remember that, then you won't be able to read. So that's a part of phonological processing. You need to have phonological memory, which is remembering what sounds sound like. And then rapid automatized naming just essentially helps you to read fluently. So you pick up quickly on the sounds in a word. Now, when we think about the science of reading is based on what we call a structured literacy approach. So when you go into schools as parents, a school that adopts proper intervention when it comes on to the science of reading should always be based on a structured literacy approach. And this is something as well that teachers should be adopting within their classroom. And really what that means is that in this program, there's a combination of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. These are all intertwined in the process of ensuring that students are a little bit more literate. So on the screen here, you see words like phonology, which is again the sound structure, orthography, which just basically means the writing system, syntax, which is a grammar that makes up the writing system. Morphology is the understanding of the components or the origins of words. And then you have semantics, which just means the relationship between words. So semantics is just what meanings you ascribe to words. And this is what a structured literacy approach is. And this is essentially what underpins a science of reading intervention in the classroom. So I'm going to start off with reading accuracy. How do we get our students to, or what does a dyslexia friendly school looks like? How do we get our students to be able to read accurately? So these are some of the three. These are, sorry, so that was a human response. I always find in the research literature around, and particularly if you're interested in reading more on this, David Kilpatrick, who is a researcher in the United States of America, he has done a wealth of research on reading accuracy and looking at how students can come to read more accurately. And so these three components on the screen that you see here are the three key pillars that need to be implemented with and start students off with who have dyslexia in order to improve their reading outcomes. So we have phonological proficiency, which is just basic phonological proficiency, alphabetic principle, and letter sound proficiency. And I'll go through each of them and I'll use some practical ways that you can use to implement within your home or within the classroom of how you can develop these skills. So I just want to highlight that you're gonna, when I think about this, you're going to do this without, when we look at phonological proficiency and how children develop it, we're not going to include any books or any letters. It's really going back to the premise that reading is a sound-based approach. The first thing that we're going to do is to work on students really understanding and processing the sound-based element of their language. So we're not going to introduce any books, any letters. It's just all about the sounds now. So how do students develop it? So really phonological or phonemic proficiency is really the ability to notice the sound structure of words. And for us who can read and who don't have dyslexia, sometimes we do take it for granted. We don't notice the sound structure. We know that we know how to read, and more likely we use, and this is where phonics comes from, for example. We know how to read, but teachers who have actually made us become aware of the sound structure of words, it really helps. And when an intervention that is really built on this for persons who have dyslexia, when this intervention is built on developing this basic phonological proficiency, it does wonders. And don't take my word for it. This is steeped in over 30 years of research. So there are two basic phonological processing skills that we need to start with. We need to ensure that students are able to blend and also segment words. And I will just give you an example of a research study that I did previously. I hope you can hear this. We did try this before. So I'm just gonna play this sound of a student who doesn't know how to blend a word. So I'm going to start off with the blending, and blending essentially means putting things together or putting sounds together. So this was a 6-year-old, and I'll play this, one of the audio samples that I collected from one of my previous studies of the student, a 6-year-old student saying the word yoy. So this is a made-up word.
Yeah, yeah, oh, yeah. Yeah, oh, yeah. What's that? Yoy, oi.
So if you're able to hear that, if you weren't able to hear it, I'll just repeat it. Essentially, the 6-year-old student was saying, yo, oi, yo, oi. And so unless you tell them to blend it, this is typically how they will read. They haven't really mastered the art of blending words. And I'll just play another segment for you here. And this is basically an older student, 9-year-old, who is able now to say the word together, or say the letters or the sounds together.
Yoy.
So I'll play that again. All right, so it's not coming up on my screen to play again, but essentially the student, if you're able to hear, said yoy and said it perfectly. So this student has been able to really develop their sense of blending the sounds in words together. And this is what we're aiming to do for students who have dyslexia. But how do we do that? How do we engage in this oral blending and oral segmenting activities? And remember, blending is putting the sounds together, segmenting is taking them apart. So oral blending activities can take place at different levels. So you can do it at using syllables, onset and rhyme. Onset means the beginning of a word, and then phonemes just at the lowest level of sound. That's a phonemic structure. So for example, you can say to a student, what would this sound like if you put these terms together? Table. And then they should be able to tell you table. So onset, if you said to them, what word does this make? Cat. They should be able to tell you cat. And then again, at the phoneme level, if you say, what word does this make? At. They should be able to say sat. Usually when you don't have a learning problem, or if you don't, a learning difficulty being dyslexia or a reading problem, usually people with dyslexia, and I do this a lot in my assessments, people with dyslexia are unable to put these together. And this is where the coaching comes in. You then make it explicit. This is where the explicit nature of the program comes in. If you find that they have a difficulty, you say table. When you put that together, it's table. So you remember, you're not going to be showing any form of letters at this point in time. It's just getting them to understand the sound structure of words. And similarly, it's important to also help them to segment. So for example, you say, can you pull apart table for me? And they can say table, or pull apart pot. They say pot, or cat, for example, cat. So doing these activities over and over again, you're actually training them and building their auditory aspects of learning. So you'll be essentially training their auditory skills, which is really directly related to reading achievement. And I said over and over again, it's interesting because when I tell parents this, and I share this to parents, and I said, you don't need any books. Not that books aren't important. We'll talk about that later. But at the very beginning, students need to understand the sound structure of words. So blending and segmenting are two ways to do that. Now, there are some considerations that we need to think about when we're blending and words that we decide to give our students or our children. So when we're blending, we need to ensure that readers are matched with the appropriate word type. So when we say appropriate, we mean that the younger they are, or if you receive an assessment and you have different levels of dyslexia in terms of how badly it is that the student or your child is affected by dyslexia. So at the lowest level, we need to make sure that we give them really simple words. So on screen here, these are the different difficulty levels. So CVC, C just stands for consonants and V for vowel. So at the lowest level, provide words that are just CVC words and break them apart, do the blending and the segmenting activities. And then the more the student you realize, or that your child, the more that they become comfortable with being able to blend and segment, then you can essentially progress them to the more difficult levels. And this is what we call scope and sequence. A lot of teachers and in curricula that really adhere to science of reading, this is important to look out for these terminologies, scope and sequence. So it doesn't make any sense you start the student off with the last word, which is a multi-syllable. MS means multi-syllable, different, multi-syllable words. Start them off early to, going back to what we said earlier in the talk. I think somebody mentioned loss of confidence. So you don't want to start them off with a multi-syllable or a CCVC word. That's really difficult because they will just lose confidence, and we don't want that to be diminished. They are already battling with their confidence level. So it's important to choose the appropriate word type. Similarly, one of the other things that I oftentimes share to teachers and to parents as well is knowing the difference between what we call continuant and stop sounds. So I'll just explain a bit between what are continuant, consonant, or continuant sounds. So essentially, when you're planning a beginner's lesson, it's important to select words that are, that begin with what we call a continuant sound. So you see on screen here, continuant sounds or continuant words usually start with these letters MSFL. And I'm not saying that you can't use the stop sounds, but when you're really providing students at the very beginning levels, you want to choose words that start with the beginning. So continuant sounds are those sounds that you can stretch or elongate, such as sat or mop or fit. And actually, studies have found that it's easier and it's easier to start with continuant sound. So just one tip that I usually tell, or one trick that I have taught teachers or parents that I've come into contact with is, how do we distinguish between what a continuant sound is or a stop sound? So I would say, if you put your hand in front of your mouth, when you say a stop sound, there's often like a little puff of air. So if you say b or k or d, p is a big one. P is the one that you sound. So if you put your hand at the front of your mouth and you say words that begin with the stop sounds, usually a puff of air comes out of you feel a puff of air. And that little puff of air happens with other stop sounds. Usually with continuant sounds, that doesn't usually happen. So if you say and that doesn't really happen. You might feel a bit of air, but it's more prominent with stop sounds. So if you remember, stop sounds are actually more difficult to start with. Now, another thing I always like to mention from the science of reading is Schwa. Maybe some of you have heard about it. I've spoken to teachers a lot, and some have heard about it. Most parents haven't heard about what Schwa is. And the reason why I'm bringing these terminologies and I want to break them down for you is because if we don't pick up on these things, we can essentially limit the confidence of the students that we want to teach at the very beginning level. But more importantly, with things like the Schwa, when we're starting students off, we want to make sure that they are correctly pronouncing. So essentially what the Schwa is that Schwa is really the name for the most common sound in English. We don't really realize it, and I'll give you an example. It really is a weak stress sound, and it really occurs in many words. So the Schwa is like, it's essentially that little sound that people add to the end of p, d, k, and g. So for example, play, using the word play, sometimes when I ask students to pronounce the word play, they would say play, and that's not the correct way to pronounce play. So we need to be careful of the sound. We are not oftentimes conscious about it. We say it unconsciously, but this is something that we want to pick up on if students are incorrectly pronouncing something. Because if you're teaching the word play to a student and they end up saying play, that's not correct. It needs to be a smooth transition, play instead of play. And that sound is what we call the schwa sound. And of course, you can't definitely stop it altogether, but we just want to reduce the likelihood so that we can improve reading accuracy and reading the correct pronunciation of words. And of course, as I said, it's hard to say the stop sound without a little bit of the schwa, but the aim is just to try to eliminate it as much as possible. Another thing I want to mention is that it is important to choose words. When you think about words, you have to think about the placement of letters in words. This is also important. So on the left-hand side of the screen, words that end in a consonant like ST and SK and ND, these are consonants. So words that end in consonants, they're usually more easier to pronounce than words that start with a consonant. So ST, struck, that's harder to pronounce than, for example, fast. So look at where the consonant is in the word. So vowel is A, E, I, O, U. These are vowels. So if the consonants are at the end of the word, if we're able to have consonants at the end of the word when we're starting off teaching students how to pronounce words, and to do that oral blending and segmenting, it's better to start them off where the consonant is at the end of the word. And as you can see, when they develop their confidence and also their proficiency level, their phonemic proficiency, then you can graduate them to words that have consonants at the beginning of the word. So it's easier and then it's more challenging. The one on the left-hand side is easier and the one on the right-hand side is more challenging. So I oftentimes get this question, so how long should we do the activities for? How long should we do these blending and the segmenting activities? Well, the research tells us that 30 minutes each day is usually recommended, but we may not have that much time. So 15 to 20 minutes may be a little bit more achievable, maybe more realistic. But if we can keep that practice consistent, it would be really good for the student who you are aiming to develop and really strengthen their basic phonological skills. Now we've spoken about oral blending activities, which helps them to develop their phonemic proficiency. Now I'm going to speak a little bit about the alphabetic principle and the letter sound proficiency. So alphabetic principle is really the insight that speech sound represent letters. So remember I said with the oral blending activities, you're not going to use introduce any letters, but there's another part of building up their reading accuracy, which is the alphabetic principle and understanding letter sound proficiency. So this is when you're now gonna introduce the letters. So these two terms at the bottom here, alphabetic principle and letter sound proficiency, they work hand in hand, and it really is the insight that the speech sounds that the students or your child have been practicing that they actually represent letters. So this is not natural. This is not naturally known when a student or even a student who has dyslexia, we take it for granted. We need to connect to them in an explicit way that these sound structures that we've been practicing, these sound structures can be represented by letters, which are the letters in reading books or on a screen, for example. So it's important to actively connect the letters to sound in a systematic, in an explicit, and a developmentally appropriate manner. So they come hand in hand, so I won't separate them, I'll talk about them together. So when we think about, how we teach children how to read in the US, I don't know if you've ever heard about the reading wars, but in the US, there is an approach to reading called the whole word reading versus the phonics-based approach. So phonics is really the alphabetic principle and connecting letters to sound. This is what phonics is. But I wanted to mention to you this opposing camp, which is called the whole word reading. And unfortunately, with whole word reading, the idea behind whole word reading is just you're memorizing words. Whereas with phonics, you're sounding out words and you're connecting the oral, what you understand the sound structure of words to letters to be, and you're actively connecting that to letters. And I'm not saying that the whole word doesn't have a place in reading, and I'll get to that. But at the very beginning of reading, it's recommended to use a phonics-based approach. And the idea is, and the reason for that is because if a child memorizes 500 words, he or she can only read those 500 words. But if a child learns the sounds of 10 letters, which is through the blending and the segmenting, that child will be able to read 353 sound words, 4,324 sound words, and 21,655 sound words. So we see through this code the power of the blending and taking time to explain and to let students understand the sounds of letters. Because if they memorize words, the only words that they're only able to read are only those words that they're able to memorize. And unfortunately, people who have dyslexia, they already have attention difficulties, and to memorize so many words is so cognitively taxing, and it will deplete their attention resources. So this is why we advocate when you're connecting the sounds to letters, use a phonics-based approach. And essentially, a common phonics-based approach is really, now that you have the mat on the page, you let students know is connected to that letter M on the page. Students actually don't know that. And you take it slowly with students and you help them to connect. So as you can see here, it's really a developmental thing, and it's making sure that you do it correctly. And in doing it correctly, students are able to read more accurately. And reading simplified, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, the research source that I've received this from, this is really a good source. And Marnie, who is the founder of Reading Simplified, she has some really, really good and amazing resources about how you can blend. She uses the term blend as you read phonics approach. So making that as explicit as possible to the student. So I highly recommend Reading Simplified as a way of getting more resources around this. But remember, I said if you remember, I said in the US, they tend to use a whole word approach where you memorize words. There is a place for that. And this is, I said I would come back to this. And there is a place for that when to use whole word approach. So you don't use it at the very beginning. You use it when students they've built up their understanding of connecting the sounds to letters. But there are some words in the English language that when you pronounce them, they don't look as though they're pronounced. You can't spell them in the same way that they are pronounced. So for example, genre or chassis or kernel or depot or cello. These are gauge, choir, yacht, iron. If you were to pronounce, you'd say iron, and people would, these are words that you just have to know how they're pronounced. So it doesn't really match the typical phonics-based approach. And this is usually when a whole word approach can be used, because these are called irregular words. So words that are not pronounced the same way that they are spelled. And in the English alphabet, around irregular words account for 20% of the English alphabet. So these are words that you just have to memorize. But by and large, if this is only 20% of the English alphabet, that means the other 80% relies upon one knowing how to connect the sounds to the letters. And so this is where we always advocate starting with that phonics-based approach. I talk a lot about the science of reading, but I think the science of learning is equally important. And this is really from psychology. So at a very high level, when you're providing these instructions, I'm just going to quickly go through these 5 points that comes from the science of learning, of some of the other things that you can do to make sure that the learning is effective, because the science of reading just gives you the coaching strategies, but the science of learning, which is another field, ensures that you implement it in an effective way. So the first thing is really to ensure that there is no, there's a difficulty reduction, which we've spoken about in making sure that you use scope and sequence, and you starting with continuant sounds as opposed to stop sounds, and looking where the consonants are in words. This is one way of reducing the difficulty. And so another part is really the support and scaffolding that you're providing to students. So I'm just trying to change the screen here. So the difficulty level is really around ensuring that another part of the difficulty level is ensuring that for students who have dyslexia, for example, remember I said there's, and Dr. I think Gad said most students who have dyslexia, they actually have ADHD as well. So try to let the environment be a little bit maybe neater, not so cumbersome. Ensure that they're only able to concentrate on what they're meant to be reading. And also you'll see the picture on the right. If you have a word cat and you want them to pronounce it, don't put anything else on the page like an owl that will confuse them, because children oftentimes they read pictures, and so I'll get to that later on in the presentation. So don't confuse the students or the child. Don't put an opposing animal on the page if you're expecting them to read cat correctly. So it's making sure that the learning environment is free from all possible distractions. So you're reducing the visual and the auditory load. So one of the other things is that you can avoid the simultaneous introduction of auditorily or visually similar sounds and letters. So for example, if you're teaching, doing your oral blending and segmenting activities, it's important to not present sounds that tend to sound alike. So b, v, or e and a. So try to separate those because that can confuse students. So maybe in one learning session, you focus on the b sound, and then in another learning session on another day, you focus on the v. So b and v sounds quite similar. So it can really confuse students if you put them in the same learning session. Similarly, visually confusing letters, try to avoid that. So the letter B looks similar to the letter D. So you'll find that a lot, and this is why you find that a lot of students who have dyslexia, they confuse B and D or P and G. And these are very confusing to students. So if you can reduce visually confusing or letters that sound similar, if you can put them in separate learning sessions, that would really help to reduce the difficulty of the learning session. And of course, remember memory limitations. In psychology, you have this magic number 7. You're only able to remember up to 7 things or hold it in working memory, and then plus or minus 2, meaning you can remember up to 9 or at least 5. There's some debate around the numbers, but the reason why I included this is that, for example, if you are giving students a list of words to read and to memorize, for example, it's important to remember memory limitations, because remember also people who have dyslexia, remember we talked about phonological memory, which is remembering the speech sounds, and we need to be mindful of that as well. The support and scaffolding, modeling is important, so be as explicit as you can. And I'll remind you at the beginning of the presentation when I presented that study from Kenya, those 4 behavioral modification strategies, modeling was actually one of them. So it's not that modeling shouldn't be able to use, but advocating more of a coaching as a broad umbrella, but also including a bit of modeling as well. So it's in the science of reading, explicitness is very important. And if a child is or a student is not saying the correct thing, then modeling is even more central to make sure that they're reading things correctly. Like for example, the Schwa, not saying the sound when they're pronouncing, because this is not correct pronunciation. And of course, the dual code theory, you've probably heard of. Dual code just means presenting information in multiple sensory pathways. So have visual and letter, that usually strengthens it. But I just wanted to highlight learning style. So I've come across, and probably you've heard this thing about learning style, that I learn better when it's visual, or I learn better when I hear. Unfortunately, learning styles is a myth. There is no such thing as a learning style. And the reason why the American Psychological Association has really debunked this myth, this idea that there's a learning style. Of course, there are such things as learning preferences, and this is why it's usually confused. So maybe you prefer to see things visually, or you prefer to hear things when you're learning, and this has been confused with learning styles. And the reason why it's a myth, and in fact why it's really detrimental to tell a student that they only learn by hearing or seeing, is that if you tell a student that, they're only going to ever learn in that way, or want or gravitate to learning in that way and not benefit from the other way. So this is why we have multisensory learning. And so that's a big thing when you're having interventions with persons who have dyslexia or reading problems, that a multisensory approach is usually different. So that's one of the things that we need to remember. And sound button cards, this is something that you can Google. And sound button cards are usually just simple cards that you can print off, and it just tells students where to break the words apart and how to put them together. And there's when you Google it, it gives you the instructions of how to use the sound button card. So it's really a support to students to help them to know when they're putting the sounds together or connecting the sounds, the sounds and letters, this is where they need to stress on to make sure they're reading it accurately. Finally, and then practice is important. Not finally, another point is practice is important. So for durable learning, you space out the review of material over time, and back-to-back repetitions are usually ineffective. So usually I'll hear teachers saying, I teach them this every single day and every single hour of the, not every single hour of the day, but every single day. That is actually not effective. And this is what we call space practice from the science of learning, where essentially getting your brain to forget is actually a good thing because it strengthens the neural pathways. And I'll give you an example. So for example, in a class where Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, if you teach the student just about the math every single day, this is actually what the research shows us is actually ineffective. A more effective approach is to space out the learning. And when you space out the learning, I know it sounds weird. When I found out about it, it sounds weird because usually I'm thinking, if you practice something every single day, that should be effective. But in fact, the brain is really an amazing thing. It's an amazing organ. When you space out the practice and you give yourself time to forget, it actually strengthens a neural pathway that helps you to remember. Feedback, there are some specific considerations around feedback. Usually it's more effective if you praise the task that the person has done rather than the person themselves. So when you praise somebody, give them feedback and you say, oh, you're such a superb person, you're such a great person, that's ego involving feedback. Task involving feedback or task-oriented feedback, which is preferred, is you did a good job today with pronouncing XYZ, or you did a good job with blending or segmenting. The research shows us that it's important to praise the task and not the person. And that's not saying that you can't boost somebody's self-esteem, but usually when you have too much ego involved in feedback, it can oftentimes be detrimental. And usually when this feedback is not geared towards something that the student has done, they're not sure what they have been doing correctly or incorrectly. It's just a generalized feedback. And then finally, guided independence, meaning I do, we do, you do. And it goes back to the whole modeling around support, but it's really a progression thing where you model what's meant to be done, and then we do it together. It could be meaning a parent and a child, a teacher in a one-on-one session, or we do a group session, and then you do it by yourself. So it's important to take that progression, that progressive approach in teaching students how to blend, segment, but also how to connect the sounds to the letters on the page. But what if they're not blending? What if you've done all this, but they're still not blending? Well, it's important. What David Kilpatrick has found is that it's just important to continue with the correct modeling of letter to sound, because if you remember that ladder that I showed you, where you have persons who are at the top and they really find it relatively easy to read, with persons who have dyslexia, everybody is different. So what that means is that the instruction is just going to be variable. And so we just need to be continuous and consistent with the modeling of letter to sound relationships in that phonics-based approach. One other thing is, where are your students or children actually looking? Are they looking correctly on the page? And this is something to check their eye movements, because in psychology, and I've done a lot of research on attention, visual orienting just means where the eyes are being oriented to. Where is Where are they looking? So visual orienting attention in the study that I did was found to be an important predictor of reading accuracy. So students who are able to stay on task, they're more likely to read more accurately. So if it is that they're not paying attention, and this is something that we need to actively check as we deliver the coaching sessions, where are they looking? You can also provide multiple choice to initially reduce the challenge. So for example, take for example, a blending activity. If a student is not blending well, or maybe going back to the whole confidence issue, if they're not blending well, you could say to them, give them options. Or does it sound like table? Or you give them options. So you don't leave it to them if you realize that they are not readily responding. So maybe you just need to provide them with multiple options of what it might sound like, and they can choose. And then you can, if they choose the incorrect thing, then you can model and direct them in the correct way. And then as Louisa Motes, and I've put her as a research source here, she has done some wonderful work on how to teach students how to read, and I highly recommend her. She's a professor in the United States, and she always said it's important to go back to that scope and sequence to teach from speech to print, meaning the blending and the segmenting, and not the other way around, meaning you're presenting the letters and then trying to do that at the same time. That is important, but it's when we'll speak about that in a bit, but it's important at the very, very basic level to teach the speech and the sound structure to begin with. And as well, and finally, for this section, it's important to consider if the blending is not working, consider a diagnostic test or a screening. And it's also important, it may not look like that they're improving, but if they do a test or a diagnostic test or a screener, you might find that they're actually improving based on the evidence-based nature of these tests. They may not be improving as quickly as we want them to. That's why assessment is very important. So assessment in the classroom helps us to know where students are and where they need to be, and how much improvement that they've gained after we've done this intervention. It might be that there is just little improvement, but maybe we can't see it. So it's important to do the diagnostic screening. So I'm going to pause here. So remember, this is reading accuracy. We have two more parts to speak about, which is the reading fluency and reading comprehension. I'm going to pause here to ask if there are any questions.
All right. If you have any question, you can just use the raise hand button and I will call you, or you can put your questions in the comment section. However, we do have some questions.
I believe yes, sorry, I was just going to say, I believe we have some questions already in the comment section.
Yeah, you can go ahead, please. Okay.
So did you want to read the questions? Because I have a difficulty with accessing the chat function.
Sure. Okay. So from Angelo's, let me go back a bit and see. From Martin. Martin was asking, talking about blending sounds, what about deaf students?
So in terms of deaf students, so I don't have expertise in that area as well, so I wouldn't be able to advise you accordingly on that. But what I can do is speak to some colleagues, because I do have some colleagues who specialize in that area. So because I don't specialize in that area, unfortunately, Martin, I wouldn't be able to give you a direct answer, or rather, I would be speaking from a place of knowledge. But what I do know from interacting with colleagues who actually do research in that area, it's really about, it really lies in the hands. So of course, this is how they communicate. And so what I would have to do is to come back to you with an answer on that after speaking with my colleagues who specialize in that area.
Fantastic. I think this even gives us opportunity in the future where if we have, we know we have a community of our brothers and sisters who are deaf, and so we can organize something like that for them so they can also gain more knowledge as to how they can implement some of these strategies to help teach children. We go on to Angelos, who is saying, great presentation, Dr. Samantha. What happened to a child who has been exposed to the whole world approach, memorizing words into brackets at the very beginning and find it difficult to blend phonics unless you mention it?
So if the good thing is with the phonics-based approach and really building their blending and segmenting, you can start at any age. So even if you've been exposed to incorrect interventions, once you are exposed to the science of reading, which is built upon understanding the sound structure of words in a systematic and direct way, it will be fine once you consistently apply that. And so I think also a lot of times with students, and I'll get into that later on in the presentation, when we speak about blending and segmenting, and it's important to explain the why behind it. A lot of times we underestimate our students, and when I go into classrooms, teachers don't use these explicit language around blending and segmenting and the importance of that. I think a part of delivering or administering that intervention to students is really to explain to them the why. Why is it that we're doing that? And once students understand the why behind that, and you actually show them results and find videos online to say, look, the student has engaged in the segmenting and blending. Look at where they were and look at where they are now. This actually encourages students, and it really helps them to know the why behind why they're doing this.
Okay, fantastic. We have a question from Jerome. Jerome is asking, how can you help a child, a dyslexic child, a child who does not speak in classroom? Okay, so Jerome is a French, and so the construction, I'm not sure if you get it, but he's asking, how can you tell a dyslexic child who does not speak in the classroom? I mean, maybe how to learn phonics and all those. I'm sure that's what he meant.
So I think with those students, they benefit from one-on-one in instruction. And I think it's really, this is why I really like having parents in these sessions as well, because some of these activities that we've mentioned are based on the science of reading. These activities can actually be done at home. And once parents have those tools equipped in their hand, the student doesn't have to actually be in the classroom setting, which is, as we spoke about, and I think somebody mentioned that classroom environments can be a little bit daunting for students, especially if they're streamed. I don't know if you do this in the Ghanaian context, but in Jamaica, we stream students based on their ability. And you find that students, my brother, he was placed in the lowest stream. And so it's sort of, makes them feel bad, sad, loses their confidence, and they don't want to speak. But I think having that one-on-one, the power is in the teacher, and having that one-on-one instruction, and also sensitizing and explaining to parents some of the things that they can do at home in a consistent way. This is why the home environment and the school environment, as we saw in that Brunfriend Berner's overview, that this student is situated within, is important, because once we can connect home learning and school learning, I think that's very powerful in the students' reading outcomes.
Fantastic. So we go on to the next question, and that is from Madame Flores. How do I help a child who is dyslexic and ADHD to read very and not forgetting?
Yeah, so with dyslexia and ADHD, so as for those of you who were here when Dr. Gad was speaking about the comorbidity that, and I did mention this as well, that with dyslexia and dyslexia, usually when a student has dyslexia, they usually have ADHD. Not always, but more often than not. And so actually this is what I did my PhD on, is really attention and reading. And I think it's important when it is that we are addressing the phonological components, this is why intentionally I included the science of learning, because the science of learning actually, when you know the science of learning and the principles that underpin the science of learning, it helps us in such a way to better deliver it. So you have to reduce the load in the classroom, the cognitive load. If there are a lot of things on the board or on the students' desk, this is a very simple way to just make students concentrate a little bit more. And in fact, this is something that I'm working on in terms of some of the interventions that can be provided to students who have ADHD and dyslexia. I can come back in another session and also share that, which would be a lovely opportunity. But for the moment, in the meantime, it's always going back to the science of learning. And I can recommend the Reading Scientist is a good website to go on. Remember, I spoke about practice and space practice and how we can help them to improve their practicing. If you go to Learning Scientist, and it's led by author, her name is Yana Weinstein, YANAWEINSTEIN. So Yana Weinstein, she's the leader of the Learning Scientists, and they do a lot on how to ensure that the instruction in the classroom is delivered in a way that even caters for students who have attention problems.
Fantastic. So I see Pamela's hand up. Pamela, I'm unmuting you so you can ask your question. Please click on it.
Good evening, everyone. Actually, mine is not a question. I just want to commend Dr. Samantha. I'm Dr. Oko Pamela Tieno. She has cited me, and I'm very happy to see her here. Thank you.
Oh, it's so lovely to meet you. When I saw this, I didn't know that you would be in the session. So it's so lovely to meet you. And I found it's very important because it's coming even from the Jamaican context. We don't have a lot of research in our context. Most of the research, you'll find it in global North countries, and it is important. It's still important research, but we still need research being done within our own context on our own students to know what works.
Yes, I appreciate your work. I appreciate your presentation, the modeling, the coaching, the prompting, the shaping, and so on. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, and I'd love to speak
I
with
did
you
a thesis
after.
on that, on behavior modification. So I'm so glad that you were able to quote my work. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my honor, and I'd love to catch up with you after.
All right, thank you.
That was really nice. We still have some questions over here, so I'll go in. And this is from Jennifer. Jennifer, this question has been addressed already. She's asking, how do deaf students improve reading accuracy who is dyslexic? And she has answered this question and saying that she would rather get someone who is specialized in this area to maybe have a session with us or get some answers to this so she can share with us. So we will move on to another person. Martin is asking, what of students with autism who hear but can't talk?
Who hear but can't talk? Well, it depends on I would say it depends on the definition of can't talk, because I know a lot of autistic children or children with autism, sometimes it's selective mutism. So they are able to speak, but they just prefer not to, and that comes with a whole host of other difficulties, because usually a person with autism usually have difficulties with engaging socially. So like anything, what I would recommend is, if something is comorbid, we need to address what's underpinning autism in terms of developing not social awareness, because they are aware to an extent, but also improving their confidence in exchanging socially. And I think with persons with autism, it is important to have smaller group instruction. So that's one way of really getting them, for those who are decide not to talk, it's selective, putting them into smaller group or even one-on-one context.
Fantastic. Okay, so another person is asking, what about learners who lack confidence in themselves? How do we rekindle these learners?
I think a part of it is really the emotion, taking into consideration the emotional side of things, because ever so often when we enter into classroom settings, and especially for me, sometimes I need to remember that even though I'm researching reading, it comes with understanding the whole child. And as part of understanding the whole child, that is also considering their emotional well-being as well. And, you know, when we, in reflecting at the beginning of the presentation, most of the times, if not, when students come to these coaching sessions and when they're provided with these interventions, we have to remember that they're coming with a whole host of emotional baggage. And when I say baggage, I mean they've just been belittled. You know, it's downtrodden and essentially beaten down, for want of a better term, not physically, but I mean emotionally. And so I think as part of addressing the before even addressing the reading component, it's about addressing the emotional component. I don't remember the author's, actually her name is Kylie Schwartz, now I remember. And what Kylie Schwartz did is every morning in the classroom, she has a book, and it's what would, I don't remember the terminology, but essentially she had the students write on a paper, what should they know? What should she know about their circumstances, essentially? And I think it's very important. And maybe even I can reach out to Kelly because I've had meetings with her. So she's written a book, but she's always interested in these sort of sessions. And maybe she could come and even speak about this as well, because she's really passionate about advocating, and she's actually done a TED Talk as well. And you can find her on YouTube, but essentially she's given strips, and this can be done to address emotional well-being as well. What should I know about you as a student that would help me to better teach you?
Love that so much, because if you ask me, what should you know about me? The first, like, if I'm working with you and you ask me this question, like, you've saved my troubles, then I'll tell you everything so that you know that I'll be reading to you, but then I'll be making mistakes. So don't make fun of me. I'll be telling you a lot. So that's very good. And we would love to connect with her sometime to see if we organize some mini workshops for people that will be interested. I see there are more questions coming in, but I know we are not done with your presentation. So should we continue and come back to it?
Yes.
All right, so you can go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for the questions. I look forward to responding to the remainder of the questions as well. So I'm going to move on to reading fluency. So we've spoken about reading accuracy, getting the students to read correctly, but there are other components, as I mentioned, around reading. So another aspect of reading is reading fluency, and reading fluency is the ability to read a text accurately, but also quickly and with proper expression. And how many words, the question that I often get is, how many words are students reading per minute? And this is a question that you should ask as well. You can time students, how many words are they reading per minute? Now, a student, you know, on average, or a typically developing student, if they're reading fluently, need to be able to read 130 correct words per minute on a 6th grade level. So by the time they reach to grade 6, they should be reading at least 130 words correctly per minute to be successful in being deemed as reading fluently. Now, in this section, we'll focus on the tools that really offer this gateway to fluency so that our students or children can really start to really achieve the end goal, which is reading comprehension. We'll talk about reading comprehension in a bit, but sort of the bridge between reading fluency is the bridge between to get to reading comprehension, essentially. So there is really a misconception that poor fluency, when a student is unable to read quickly or fluently, there's this sort of misconception that have been going around that poor fluency emerges because students cannot quickly access the words that they know. But time and time again, the research actually shows us that poor fluency actually emerges because of a small vocabulary size. So in other words, if readers who are not fluent will likely have a limited sight word vocabulary. And when we say sight word, we just mean the words that that they have been able to commit to memory, even those words that they use, they learn through the whole word approach, as well as even the phonics-based approach. After a while, these words should be committed to your memory. And so this is why some students are unable to read accurately. So since fluency is determined by the size of your sight vocabulary, how can we help to develop this? So really what is important here is a skill that we call orthographic mapping. So orthographic mapping is just really a mechanism that readers use to quickly and efficiently turn unfamiliar words into familiar words. So usually when you're learning how to read and you see words for the first time, or maybe the second time, they're not really committed to your memory. You need to see them over and over again. But the process that in your brain that's called orthographic mapping, this mechanism, it helps you to quickly turn unfamiliar words into familiar words. And really, it is a process that we use to store words for instant retrieval. So you find that weak readers, including students who have dyslexia or reading difficulty, they oftentimes, the research shows us that they have very inefficient orthographic mapping skills. So how then do we build these skills? So essentially, sight word vocabulary is all the words that you're able to recognize without, it just comes fluently to you. And so in your brain, you have this part of your brain that we call the lexicon. More commonly, it's known as a mental dictionary. So in your brain, you've stored all these words that you've learned and you've committed them to memory. So quickly, when you see them on the page or on the screen, you're able to just read it fluently because you've committed that to memory. So it's all the words that you've been able to recognize. Now, generally speaking, what the research shows us is that you need about 1 to 4 exposures generally to add words to your sight word vocabulary. So if you see the word 1 or twice, maybe for quick learners, but you need to see it about 4 times to make sure that it's committed to your memory. For persons with dyslexia or children with dyslexia, it takes you a longer time. So you need to see it on average between 15 to 25 times because you know, persons with dyslexia are known to be inefficient orthographic mappers. But with some of the strategies that we use here, or that we can use here, it really helps to reduce that number of exposure for students who have dyslexia down to the typical developing 4 exposure. So how do we do this? So we did speak a little bit about letter to sound proficiency, which is mapping, you know, first you map the sound to the letters, and then in the end, when you start to build in that reading space, it's sort of a dual component. You map letters to sounds. Now, what I want to concentrate on in terms of how you build orthographic mapping, and again, this is some of the research, intervention research based on David Kilpatrick. We spoke about phonemic proficiency, which is the oral blending, the blending and the segmenting. Those are basic phonemic proficiency skills. Not to really, and this is just for accuracy, not to really build the fluency, the orthographic mapping, phonemic awareness is still important, but we're going to do it a little bit more advanced. And I'm going to give you some examples. And of course, it's important to practice these, put these skills into practice. So we spoke previously about these segmenting, blending. We didn't speak about phoneme isolation. It's just basically, we didn't speak about it in terms of when you have sat, the word sat, and you say at, you're breaking down it into just the smallest units. You're isolating the phonemes in words. That's what phoneme isolation is. We spoke a lot about blending and segmenting, and these are just the simplest ways of building phonemic proficiency, which we spoke about, and this is to build reading accuracy. Now, to really build fluency, we have to take it up a notch, and we need to implement some other phonemic awareness, phonemic proficiency skills, and that brings into consideration addition, deletion, and substitution. And I'll give you some examples of that. So what we found through David Kilpatrick's research is that students who have had advanced training in phoneme manipulation had the greatest gains in reading instruction. So they're more, not only are they more accurate in reading, they're more fluent reading, and they become more efficient in terms of orthographic mapping. So you remember orthographic mapping is being able to quickly commit words that you learn to your mental dictionary, so that the next time you see them, you can read them fluently. And I think there was a question before that someone asked around what if inefficient methods have been used. Actually, in one of David Kilpatrick's study, some of the students, they were actually being exposed to inefficient practices, but when they started to be exposed to interventions based on the science of reading, you found that they were a little bit more advanced and they had greater gain. So you add phonemes, you delete phonemes, and you substitute them. So to do that, we use an integrated approach. 2 simple but powerful steps: switch it and read it, sort it and read it. And I'm going to talk about them. And I recommended Reading Simplified earlier on, where Marnie, who is a literacy specialist, she's the founder of Reading Simplified. I'm using one of her examples today, so I just want to give her the credit as well. And she puts it beautifully in this integrated approach where you switch it and read it and sort it and read it. So in terms of the switch it and read it, she essentially went ahead and sorry, I'm just trying to get my screen to move. Okay, so I'll just bring these up all at once. So essentially, in switching and reading, instead of blending and segmenting, a little bit more, a way to do it in a more advanced way, which is an advanced phonological processing proficiency, is that you start off maybe with the word sled, and you then say to the student, can you replace the E sound with the I sound? And then they would say slid. And then if you say, what if you replace the D with T? They would say slit. What if you replace the L with P? They would say spit. And then reversal is, you ask them, now what if you reverse spit? They should be able to say pips. So this is a little bit more complex than the typical oral, the blending and the segmenting. And this, again, you can do this orally. So I've just posted at different points in time where you're deleting and then you're adding. So you're deleting the letter sound and adding another letter sound. And as you go through that process, you then reverse the word or reverse the sound. And this actually continues to strengthen the learning pathway to understand sounds a little bit more. And what the research has shown us is that using techniques such as switch it and read it, or switch it and say it, for example, you're actually helping the student to really build and strengthen those advanced phonemic, phonological proficiency skills. And then the whole idea is to, as I said here, sequencing is important. So you can first do this orally, and then you continue doing it on paper and really connecting these sounds back and forth to the letters that students are seeing on paper. So again, this is what we call scope and sequence. And of course, there are some places that are still operating, not necessarily under the pandemic as strictly, but you do still have some hybrid classroom settings. And even if you don't have hybrid classroom settings because of the pandemic, you still have teachers who might want teach students remotely. So you can actually teach these, the switch it and read it virtually. So you can consider selecting a few digital tools, for example, and then you use them a lot. So Google Documents is usually a good way to build advanced phonological skills. So an example is that you can open a Google document. If you're a teacher and you have the words separate, you have letters just all on the page, you create them. You can copy and paste letters from Google, and then students can then navigate in that same document, and they can put the letters together. If you ask them to put CAT together, and then you say replace the with the sound, and then they replace and put the cut. So it's really getting them to really continue to connect the sound with letters. So you're still going to continue even at this stage, because we want to build and strengthen upon what they've been doing previously. Sort it and read it really presents all the main spellings of a given word simultaneously. So it's sort of a mental organizer, and I've gotten this research example from Marnie as well, from Reading Simplified. And the sentence here, as you can see on the screen with the picture, is go home to show the boat to Joe. And so if you notice in this sentence, the O is, and they have different, they have the same pronunciation, but they look different. So if you notice, you ask the student to sort the O sound under the correct column. So they would have, they would put home underneath it. They would put show. You wouldn't highlight it first in the sentence, of course, but it's highlighted here today to show you that the different sounds actually have different spellings. So show and boat, that same sound structure is in the word. So you're getting the students to put them underneath the correct column, and it actually helps them with their spelling as well, because that's another thing that we need to consider when we come on to reading, is that reading and writing, they're intimately tied to each other. So while we're building the reading skills and the letter to sound knowledge and sound to letter, we want to also present things in a way where we can help students to build their spelling skills. I wanted to highlight something here. So Skippy the Frog, I see this going around. It is absolutely incorrect. And the reason why I wanted to highlight it here is because some of these interventions or ways of doing or approaching reading instruction and the science of reading, it doesn't align with the science of reading. So here's a common example that's typically used: Skippy the Frog, meaning that when you're reading a word, you skip the tricky word and you read it to the end, or you guess and you go back and try again. The science of reading doesn't advocate Skippy the Frog, and I'm not saying that students won't have difficulty, but it's important to model the correct thing so that students aren't picking up incorrect ways of reading. By skipping things, it will actually just break their fluency in reading. And also, not only that, but if they're skipping out really, really good details, they're less likely to comprehend information. So we don't advocate using this Skippy the Frog technique, where we tell students to just skip the word and go ahead. And we also don't advocate the 3 queuing system. So the 3 queuing system is not a good approach. So it's not a good approach. I mean, the bottom line is that it doesn't, the answer to that is it's not rooted in the science of reading. So usually what happens at a very broad level in the 3 queuing approach is that usually teachers tell students, or say, does it make sense? Does it sound right? Does it look right? This is not aligned with the science of reading, because those questions actually just facilitate guessing and guessing what the word actually is. And so I'm not saying that when you're prompting students or cueing, that is actually a part of behavior modification, where you're providing some prompts or cues, but the way how it's implemented, usually it's usually associated with guessing. So there's a right and wrong way to be able to prompt students correctly, so that they're actually not only reading accurately, but they're putting a position to really strengthen those orthographic mapping skills. What we want students to do, however, is to be exposed. Instead of implementing things like Skippy the Frog or guessing. The reason why I posted this article here on screen is because this is the hallmark of as a reading researcher, David Scher's work it really has informed us how students build their orthographic mapping skills. And the way to do that is not to skip words, but it's through this process of what we call self-teaching, meaning that students are provided with the appropriate basic skills of how to read, and then they expose themselves to more text. And when they expose themselves to more text, they're actually building vocabulary and they're teaching themselves, I can apply what I've learned in different contexts. I can apply the sound structure of words in different contexts. So David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis has been really well renowned in the field of reading research. And this is on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen is what we call the Matthew effect. So this is the opposite of self-teaching. If students aren't provided with the correct way of going about doing things, Keith Stanovich actually coined the term, Robert Merton coined the term Matthew effects, but Keith Stanovich applied it within the context of reading. And what the Matthew effect is essentially, it's from the Bible, so it's biblical. So in the Bible, in the scripture of Matthew, it says the rich gets richer and the poor gets poorer. This is the same thing in reading. If you, as a reader, you aren't reading as much as you're meant to do and building your vocabulary, you're actually being more deficient. So the more you can read, the more proficient you are, the more reading you're able to achieve, and you get stronger in your reading skills. However, if you are less equipped with the strategies to read, you actually don't want to read, and you get poorer. So you're deficient in your reading. So these are just some of the things that we need to consider. Not using approaches like the guessing and Skippy the Frog. This doesn't really help the student, and it actually sets them back. And unfortunately, and one of the things that I wanted to highlight, which I'm sure we know, that early intervention is the best. And so usually you find that students who learn these strategies after grade 3, it's not that they can't benefit from them, but they usually need more consistent approaches. So it's always advocated by researchers that grade 1 to grade 3, this is when the early identification comes in to really modify these poor reading behaviors. Now, another way to make it really interesting for students is to gamify the learning session. So I've just posted 3 ways to do that. A great way to get the students' eyes on print, especially boys. We find that when you compare boys to girls, they tend to not want to, boys are less likely to want to engage in reading. And in fact, you have a higher percentage of boys who are diagnosed with dyslexia. So some of the ways that you can get them to engage is to put it in a really fun way. And teachers are usually good with doing that, but for parents, it's important to use things like act it out. So for example, it's like a bingo approach, and instead of before acting it out, they have to read what's on the card, and they have to read it correctly. In the middle, you can use different riddles, scavenger hunts, and then, for example, steal it. The aim is for students to collect cards with the same focus sounds for the week. So if the students have a particular sound that you're focusing for the week, they need to maybe exchange a card that has the same sound, maybe from another student in the classroom. So it's just like, it's similar to like the Pokemon cards where students used to exchange Pokemon cards in the classroom. So instead of that, you can exchange cards that has been assigned as your sound for the week. So these fun ways are really a great way to get eyes on print and for students to actually enjoy the learning process, because we want students to be engaged in reading and to really enjoy what they're doing. And then finally, one of the things that I wanted to highlight in terms of fluency, going back to some of the progression that we've been speaking about, it's important to use decodable books. So when I say decodable books, it just means books that are at the appropriate level for students. So Spellphabet, which I've linked here as a free resource, you can go on Spellphabet and they have a long list of resources that you can get and it maps it out for students based on their reading level, but also the stage that they're at. So by introducing decodable books or comics, for example, the comic is displayed here on screen. This is also another fun way, but also a scientifically evidence way to ensure that students are being presented with books that are not too difficult for them. And then as students become a little bit more proficient and fluent, then there are levels there that they can graduate to. And Spellfabet is one good website to do that. And here, as I said, this is a resource that I was recommending, and this is a screenshot just from the Spellfabet. Even though it says shop here, they do have paid for resources, but also you can download free resources that are equally good. So in a nutshell, when we think about reading fluency, it's important to think about fluency as increasing the size of your sight vocabulary. And by doing so, you're being exposed to more text, you're improving your orthographic mapping skills and also getting a little bit more reading experience. And this is really underpinned by the students, your letter to sound proficiency. Now I'm looking at it, the arrow should have been going the other way, which makes more sense. Letter sound proficiency, you're building your orthographic skills, which increases the size of your sight vocabulary, and then overall increases the word reading fluency. So I'll pause here again before I move on to the last section, which is, last section is not a long section, but I think it's important to speak about reading comprehension. But I'll take questions if we do have time for that, Rosalind.
We do have time for that. And if you can, are we done with your presentation?
No, we have one section. Or did you want me to just finish it and then we have the question? Because this is the reading comprehension is not a long section.
Okay. Okay. So let's see if we can take one question. So from Angelos, can you explain further the observational learning related to phonemic proficiency and the discrepancy between task praise and child ego praise?
Oh, okay. So the ego involving feedback and the task involving feedback. So usually when you're giving different types of feedback in the classroom, it's not uncommon for a teacher to say, "You're such a fabulous student. You're so smart," using those adjectives. And that is fine. But when you're giving an intervention or administering or delivering an intervention to students, that feedback is important, but it's not as important as task involving feedback, because by saying, "You're so smart, you did a good job today," that's very broad. They don't know what they did right. So it's better to be more specific. And this is why the research has found that task involving feedback, meaning feedback that you give about the task rather than saying the student is smart, is more effective in improving reading outcomes and more broadly student learning. Because if you then say to a student, "Your pronunciation on this was good today, you didn't do so well on this part today," then the student has something to go off to know, okay, I should be doing more of this and less of that. So it's a little bit more specific and it is a little bit more targeted to what the student is doing. I'm not saying that you can't say, "Oh, you're smart," but usually that's just broad and the student doesn't know what did I do correctly today.
All right. How is delayed development of growing child related to dyslexia and other learning disabilities?
So could you clarify delayed development?
Yes. So how is delayed development of growing child relate to dyslexia and other learning disabilities? I don't know. And Emmanuel Edem, you asked this question, so if maybe she needs a bit of explanation and you're still here, you can ask the question. Let me see if he's here. And then would you like to expand on the question? You can unmute yourself.
Because when I'm thinking about delayed development, the reason why I'm asking the clarifying question is because when you say delayed development, dyslexia itself is a form of delay in the development. So that would be sort of self-explanatory in terms of a delayed, but delayed development can also mean a physical delay in development or maybe an intellectual delay in development. So for example, when you say intellectual delay, usually that's linked to a person's IQ. And so persons who have dyslexia, it's not an IQ deficiency. Usually they're okay. When I have administered IQ tasks to students who have dyslexia, they don't have an IQ deficiency. Their IQ is normally really high or within the average range. And in fact, this is what dyslexia is. Dyslexia is really an unexplained difficulty. It cannot be explained by poor IQ because they don't have poor IQ. It cannot be explained by poor instruction because sometimes you do give them instruction, but it's still they're still having that difficulty. So this is why you need a systematic, direct and explicit instruction that's based on the science of reading.
Adam, I hope that answers your question. I know that you're now.
Yes, please. I asked the question because you find a child who is, let's say, 6, 7, 8 years, and the child is unable to even read 2-letter sounds words. So, and even they also delay in walking. A child who has delay in walking, let's say 2 years, it takes a child to 2 years for him to walk. Whether that can actually have effect on the child, that's what I mean.
Not necessarily so, because that would be a different form of delay. And time and time again, the delay that we see with students who have dyslexia is just that they have poor understanding of speech sounds. So once you address that, making them more phonological aware, despite the delay in that physical development, students are okay in terms of learning, because it's similar to, for example, if a student is maybe in a wheelchair, they have a physical barrier, but they might not necessarily have a barrier in reading. And that is more likely due to the fact that they have been exposed to instruction on phonological processing. So that's always the key point to remember, that dyslexia and reading problems and dyslexia more specifically is a delay in the speech sounds, understanding of speech sounds.
Okay, well understood.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So for now, we will continue on our presentation, because she has few left.
I don't know if Hakizamana, am I pronouncing it correctly? Did you have your hand raised?
What's name?
Oh, I just saw somebody with raised hand, but
Okay, I think it's down now. So we'll continue and then take the questions. We highly encourage you to put your questions in the chat room so that we'll ask at the end of the presentation. And if you want to also speak, you can raise your hand when this presentation ends. You know that this presentation is the 5th session for our training sessions that we've been doing since March. We have the last bonus one, which is coming on in August, but at the end of this, we'll announce how you can get your certificate. So please relax and enjoy the rest of the training. Dr. Samantha, over to you.
thank you. So I've just checked the time and I have 7 minutes. So the remainder of the presentation is not too long. So I'm just going to give a high level, because I think it's important to speak about the reading comprehension element. So we've spoken about reading accuracy, reading fluency, but the end goal of reading is to understand what you're reading. So if you look at this text on screen now, and I ask you to tell me what this means, you might tell me it's quite difficult. And the reason for that is because you might not be able to recognize some of the words. And this is really related to vocabulary. And I think it's so beautiful because if you realize the thread of the presentation is that you learn the speech sounds and you build on your vocabulary, and that actually helps you to the expansion of the vocabulary helps you to improve your reading comprehension or understanding what you're reading. So really, reading comprehension, the goal of reading is to extract meaning from the text. Now, previous estimate really suggests that 1 in 10 primary school students, can be placed in a category called poor comprehenders. So in fact, you can have dyslexia, but you can be a good reader, but still be a poor comprehender. And so you can read accurately and you can read quickly, but you don't understand anything that you're reading. And that can happen. But also you have persons more often than not who have dyslexia, they can also be poor comprehenders. So I just wanted to make that distinction as well. And so, as I mentioned, vocabulary is important for reading comprehension. Now, the big question in research is, are all parts of comprehension related to, are all parts of comprehension affected by poor vocabulary? And not necessarily so, because I'm going back to the simple view of reading. So this is sort of a model that we tend to use in reading research. There's nothing simple about reading, but they call it the simple view of reading, that reading comprehension is a product of being able to identify a word and language comprehension. Now, the part of the simple view of this simple view that's really affected, usually in poor comprehenders, usually they're able to identify the word. So remember, I said that you can identify the word accurately and you can read it fluently. So they're okay on that end. But more often than not, it's the language comprehension aspect of this model that's preventing them from reading, from understanding the text in general. And I'll just give you some high-level overview of what this language comprehension component involves and how we can help students. So with language comprehension, students need to build their vocabulary. They need to have background knowledge to understand. They need to understand language structures, literacy knowledge, and verbal reasoning. And one way to do that is through these cards. So usually what teachers do, and when you go into a classroom that's built on the science of reading, it's so amazing to see teachers taking the time to build vocabulary cards. And the vocabulary cards usually have the word on them that they want the student to learn. And what they tend to do is to provide them with vocabulary knowledge. So teach them a word. So you're adding to the students' vocabulary. They didn't know this word decompose before, now they know it. However, they just didn't leave it there because they want to really strengthen their language comprehension. So in order to do that, they help them to know what the background of it, what does it mean? What does decompose mean? And it means to take apart or to break down. They help them to also understand the language structure of the word. Language structure meaning, and also literacy knowledge. So language structure mean where the word has come from, maybe, root words. And usually when you know root words, you're able to break down things into different components, put them together, but also know meanings behind words. And actually it was very impressive. So when I was in Australia and I used to collect data in classrooms, I would go into the classrooms, and initially these cards might look difficult, but students would come up to me and they would tell me, this is the word, this is what it means, this is the root of the word, the first letters, this is what it means, opposite, and come means together, com, and pose means to place. And so they would even tell me examples of other words that can be linked to these root words. So when you understand the root of words, you and the meaning behind it, you can understand what decompose actually mean, because you understand what each component of the word means. So that is how you help to build vocabulary, but you're also giving students the power of understanding where words emerge from, and how an understanding of that can help them to understand the word in general. And it's so amazing to see students being able to verbalize that after teachers have taught them to do that. And this activity can also be fun because teachers can make some cards and then students can go and make their own vocabulary cards. Another thing is reading aloud and talking really strengthens oral comprehension and verbal reasoning. So there's a particular website that's called Storyline Online, and this is where celebrities, mainly celebrities, but also other persons come online and they read to students. And this is free. These resources are free. So by exposing students to, again, the sound structure and reading aloud activities for 15 minutes, it actually strengthens their oral comprehension and then overall their reading comprehension skills. And then I just have maybe 2 slides, but I just want to highlight within the classroom to build comprehension. On the left-hand side of the screen, this is called Nominees Notes. And again, this is free of cost if you type in Google. And what Nominees Notes is, it's been done by a group of researchers, and they just present 1 page of current research and what can be done. Basically, it's making research more accessible. So it's just 1 page. It's really an easy read. What I like about it is that they use simple language so that this can be taken and implemented in an area where it's needed. So a part of building, comprehension is through reciprocal teaching. And there are 4 ways to do that. You summarize what has been read. You ask students to summarize what has been read. You then encourage them to ask questions about the text, ask them to predict what they think will happen next, and then clarify any unfamiliar words. So these processes, especially the last one, helps them to build the vocabulary. But not all of the strategies are equal. These are just 4 strategies. And you'll notice I've highlighted 2, the first 2. And what the research has found is that these 2, summarizing and asking questions, they're actually the most effective in strengthening students' reading comprehension. And of course, when you do use these strategies within the course of 6 weeks, usually, and doing it twice weekly, you see noticeable gains in the students' reading comprehension. And then finally, I did say before I end the presentation, the next slide is a take-home message, but I wanted to speak just maybe a couple of seconds on these free reading assessments. So the center that I work in currently is an assessment center, and usually, you get referrals to go to different or give referrals. We don't provide referrals, but in the classroom setting, usually teachers refer parents to get their child tested. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that as a parent or even as a teacher, whenever you notice that maybe a psychologist is testing students and maybe the report has come back, it's important to actually check the test or the form of assessment that's being used, because a lot of times there are unfortunately tests out there that are not evidence-based. So I've taken this screenshot and I can circulate this to Rosalind to circulate to persons who are interested. These are some evidence-based tests to screen for phonological awareness, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. And again, these are free. All of them except the last one is not free. And that's only because the last one is offered through an iPad app. But besides that, they're all free and they can be downloaded online, and you're provided with a list of instructions. So if as a parent you're not comfortable using that, you can maybe recommend to the teacher so that the teacher can use it. But these are generally evidence-based assessments that are used to assess and to screen for maybe difficulties in these types of area. And I've made it a point in the left-hand column to also provide reference that these are evidence-based and they've been tried and tested. But it's also important for parents and teachers when these reports come back from psychologists. It's good to say, okay, I can check it against these tests that are normally used, evidence-based tests, to see, is it really an evidence-based test? Because if it's not an evidence-based test, then the results are not reliable and they're not accurate. And so this can really delay proper identification and then subsequent intervention. Now, the take-home message is for maximum academic gain, students need systematic, explicit and engaging, and success-oriented instruction. Now, systematic means a teacher has a specific scope and sequence for introducing each skill that we spoke about today. Explicit means that the teacher provides, or even parent provides, clear and precise instruction and also feedback. And engaging instruction that is success-oriented involves increased active participation in the instructional activities while minimizing errors and providing immediate corrective feedback when errors occur. So by engaging students a little bit more and making them active using games, and for example, this can be quite important for the student engagement aspect of it. And of course, as we've spoken about, you consider the whole child when you're interacting with your children or your students. So I want to end with this quote from David Kilpatrick, and he says, "We teach reading in different ways, but students learn to read proficiently in only one way. And that one way is based on the strategies that are underpinned by the science of reading." I just want to thank you for listening. And if you do want to get in touch with me, if you're interested in getting any sort of information, maybe this is the quickest way rather than having Rosalind to email everyone. You can email me at my work email address displayed here on screen. Thank you.
Awesome. Wow, 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 wow. Thank you so much, my dear friend. Oh my goodness, you are always amazing. You've been with us since the beginning of Africa Dyslexia, and it's like every year you bring in a lot of exciting information to enrich our minds. Let's show Dr. Samantha some love in the room. And please, if you have any question, raise your hand, use the hand raise button, and I will call you as well. And if Dr. Samantha, you can stop sharing the screen, then we can bring everybody's face on and you can see them now. Awesome. So now we have a full gallery view. If you have a question, please raise your hand up. Let's see what people are saying also in their chat room. Okay, so now you can also see the chat here. Someone is asking a question. Who says, "Great presentation." It's actually good presentation. In a country like Ghana, where the class population is 40 to 70 plus, how effective can a child with learning disability cope? And I think you mentioned something like this concerning Jamaica. So you can elaborate on it again.
So in terms of coping, yes, I think we are quite similar in the Ghanaian and the Jamaican context. They're quite similar, because I remember growing up, it used to be 70 students in one classroom for one teacher. And so oftentimes you don't get that sense of students being able to actively participate. And unfortunately, it is just something that it is a limitation for us in our own context. And so one of the things that, or rather not one, but more often than not, students who have dyslexia, it's not surprising that they're left behind, but the teacher tried her best, because you're able to use group instruction. So the blending and segmenting is usually one way, but still sometimes students slip through the cracks because these students may not want to speak up, and this is where the one-on-one instruction is important. But you know, even though I don't necessarily like streaming, where you put, in England they call them the top set and the bottom set. In Jamaica, unfortunately, we say first brightest and last brightest, which is really the meaning. We need to change the language around it, but I think the intention is there, because if you have a group of students who are academically inclined and proficient, it's actually, it was really good for my brother as well. Yeah, it was really good for my brother as well, in terms of how he was in a special education unit. And so then he transitioned into the primary school. And I think having maybe separate instruction, if possible, would be useful. If not, I think another way that we can use it to our advantage is really integrating the power of the home and the school connection, because in these developing country contexts, we need to be innovative and creative in the way that we're approaching situations. And I think one way to do that is to bring the parents in. Now, which we should always be doing anyways. But in some instances, you have cases where parents are not confident, because in some cases, parents have dyslexia. So they too are not confident. So if it is that the parent can even recommend somebody from home to do it, because I think until the ideal situation is for us to have fewer numbers in the classroom. And I think from my perspective, I don't have much power over that because that's a government policy level. But I think we can leverage things like pairing maybe stronger readers with the weaker readers, or readers who have dyslexia. That's one, using the pairing approach, but also building that connection between the home and the classroom.
Awesome, thank you for that. From Dr. Mabel, she's asking, she said, great presentation to you. And is the CTOPP dyslexia assessment evidence-based?
It is. I just couldn't hold it on the screen in the screenshot. So that's why I said, if you want a list, I can send you the list. So the CTOP is one that I use quite regularly. I haven't used the second version. I know there's a second version. I've only just used the original CTOP, but it is in fact evidence-based.
Please, if you have any question, you can put up your hand and I'll call you to ask the question. You can put your question as well in the comment chats over there, and I will read it out to Dr. Samantha. We do have Kay Asante, and Kay, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. It's not actually a question, Samantha. It's appreciating the presentation tonight. I'm going through the reading accuracy, the fluency, and the reading comprehension. I mean, it's so detailed, and learned a lot. I would have to watch, listen to the video over and again to be able to digest and fully understand everything that you have called out tonight. I'm so much grateful for being part of this meeting. As you can see, a single father, my son wouldn't allow me to fully understand everything I've taught. So I personally am grateful for being part. Thank you. Anytime you come to Ghana, I'll prepare you fufu and chicken rice.
I will hold you to that. I've been to Ghana once, but that was a very long time ago. It was in 2011. So I think it's due course now for me to visit. And being in England, I think I'm closer now to Ghana. So I need to make a trip there.
We are waiting for you.
Just 6 hours you're here. Any other question or comments? Anyone who would like to ask something before we leave here tonight? Okay, as we wait for someone to put their hand up. Okay, we have Magita. Let's unmute Magita. Okay.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for the presentation. In fact, it's been an eye-opener, especially for us special educators. But my question, it's not a question, it's a suggestion that if from time to time you can link up with the Division of Special Education with the Ghana Education Service, so that we can have some workshops, seminars on these things, because it's difficult giving such information to people in our communities and even in the big cities, especially dealing with children with special needs. So if from time to time we can have such interactions one-on-one, you come to Ghana, you organize this fora, I would be very, very happy.
It means I definitely have to come to Ghana now.
Yes, you have to.
But it is important. You're welcome. It's Magita.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's very important. And just reflecting on what you just said in terms of just especially persons in remote communities who even may not have the resources or even the time to join. But if you tell them just come to this center for 1 hour and you get the resources, I think that would be really good. So I'm gonna have to definitely plan with Rosalind
We'll be
about how we
expecting you so that you eat more fufu. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you're on mute, Rosalind.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Magita, thank you so much for you putting that action in us. We'll see what we can do, but what I can tell you is, yes, we are in close contact with the GES and we're trying to find our way through to them. And so hopefully we will get through one day, and all of us will be happy. We know that this is needed, and especially more in the rural communities. That's where we need it, because some people even want to join, but internet there is not good for them to be able to join. So we have to find ways as to how we can take some of these trainings and information over to them. We have Esther's hand up. So Esther, I'm unmuting you and you can ask your question.
Okay, so my name is Esther, and I just joined quite late because I didn't get the link early from a friend. I just got it and immediately I joined, but only to find out that the meeting is already over. But I really wish I could get maybe a handout or something that I could read more to really get what I missed, because from what others are saying, I can clearly see that the training was really insightful. I don't know if we can do something about that for us, those who just joined or something. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. So yes, are you on our Telegram page and do you receive our emails? Because if you do, you will know that we share all the videos, like the recorded videos and the slides after each presentation. So definitely, if you're not in the group, I'm going to be posting the link and you should join, because these are the places we're going to share all the resources. We have a question from Wahab. Please, can a learner who reads without punctuations consider as dyslexic child, and how can he address such a learner?
No, the short answer is well, it depends. I can't always say yes or no, because then it would need to depend on the assessment. But just with that information, no, it's just that the student may not have an understanding of the appropriate conventions of reading, when to pause, because reading, and that's a part of reading accuracy, but that's something completely different in terms of the conventions of reading, how to pause. So it would be good to teach them, grammar instruction would be good, but also more explicit instruction in punctuation, and when to pause, when to stop, because I have experience of a student reading in that fashion, and it's not necessarily a case where they have dyslexia or have a reading difficulty because they are reading. It's just that they need more explicit direct instruction in the conventions of expression.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I think that's for the questions, but if any question pop up before we leave here, we'll be able to take. We have a few minutes to leave here, and as we are working on that, I'd just like to share the link for you. Listen, I'm sharing the link for you to be able to request for a certificate. Please request for the certificate if you know you have taken more than 3 sessions of the trainings that has been happening since March. Please don't request it if you just attended once, if you just attended twice. All the recordings for the training is on our YouTube page, and we're going to share the links for all of them again. If you're able to take all of them, later on you can request for it and we can bring it. Also, when I share the link with you, the link is asking for your full name that you want it appear on the certificate, and also the the email address we should send it to is going to be automatic. Please, if you don't put in good email address or your correct email address, you're not going to receive a certificate, because we are not going to manually be checking for your email corrections. We can't do that because a lot of people are here or took the training. So please make sure your email address is correct. The name of your name spelling is correct. And I'm putting the link here. The certificate is free. The entire training we have done so far is free, but I will also put Africa Dyslexia Momo number, which is a mobile money number there together. If you are led to and you want to support the work we do, you're free to send us something from your heart. We'll be very happy so that you can help us continue to be able to organize such trainings and send to you. Madam Samantha has done a very wonderful work with us, and I hope you can rewatch her video again and be able to understand all that was said. So the link is here, and the next thing I'm going to share is the Africa Dyslexia mobile money account, and if you are led to, you can support the work that we do. All right, so I have shared the details. We have the link for you to request. Once again, please check your email address, because a lot of people registered and their email addresses were wrong. So when we are sending you emails, it's very, very hard for us to get through to you. I've shared all the details you need. Is there any other question before we leave here? Comments, please, let's show some love to Dr. Samantha in the chat room. Let's show some love. And one more announcement is next month, August 19th and 20th, we're going to have a training with somebody from GES. They are going to tell us where we can get resources when it comes to learning disabilities in Ghana, and a lot what the government is doing. So please make sure you are part of that. And Dr. Seti is going to come back to train on one aspect of topic she left out from the last training she did. So that's going to make up all the 5 sessions we plan for the year. So make sure you are part of it. I also want to highlight Dr. Mabel. Dr. Mabel is organizing a paid training. She has put in her links and stuff in the Telegram group. Please sign up. It's a paid training. So it's a person is $150, and I think a group of 10 is $700 or so. So please get in touch with her and sign up for her training out as well. Thank you. Dr. Samantha, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for everything. Thank you for your time and energy in putting up this training. You have always been with us. And I know we can pay you if we have to pay you. We don't have the capacity, but you have never said no to us. Hopefully one day we will have you here in Accra, in everywhere, 16 regions in Ghana, for you to come and support the work that we do here. But know that we so much love to you back in England, and we really love you from ADO side. If you have any last words, you can say it, and then we will depart from here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure for me, and I mean, this is what I live for. And so it's always a pleasure and an honor, and just interacting and hearing the questions. And for me, it's just always being a blessing to whomever I can, because the knowledge is there. It's really just to share it. So thanks for having me, and I do look forward to coming to Ghana.
Yeah, you look forward coming to eat our fufu. But you have a lot of words that is going to you. People are saying thank you, well done, this was great, and all that. And lastly, I'm putting their Telegram link in the chat, so if you're not there, you can join as well, and subscribe to our YouTube channel when you watch the videos as well. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the rest of the weekend, and we will see you on the 19th and 20th of August for our last training section for the year, and then we will announce what next after August. Take care and bye-bye.
About teaching people in prison how to read, teaching them how to read and how to be better, because once they leave prison, they can help society, they can help their community, it will facilitate their rehabilitation. So the short answer is yes, dyslexia, definitely you can help them, they can benefit society, but if you don't help them, they can harm society.
I absolutely agree, but listening to the numbers you are calling of people in juvenile and prison is quite high, and I will encourage. So I just got information that why is it that today being like the last day of our training, we didn't take a picture, and most people have left. Forgive me. It's actually a participant who's just sent me that message. So I don't know if those of you here, you are keen. It's not